Imagine watching your country lose almost a quarter of its people in just 5 years. Picture a place just 90 miles from Florida, where a carton of eggs now costs nearly half of what most folks make in a month. And here's the kicker. What do you get when a country hits economic rock bottom, can't keep the lights on, sees millions walk away, and faces new heat from its biggest rival? All while a group of aging leaders tries to hold things together, not even sure who's next in line. I'm Emma Chamberlain, and this is Infographics. Today, we're throwing the spotlight on the mess unfolding in Cuba. We'll dig into how Cuba has seen the fastest population collapse anywhere this century, how the economy tanked after years of bad decisions, and why the long-standing communist government, tough enough to survive U.S. pressure for decades, might finally have found a challenge it can't withstand. Let's just look at the numbers. They're jaw-dropping. Back in 2020, Cuba's population was about 11.2 million. Fast forward 5 years, and independent estimates say as many as 2.75 million have left the island. That's nearly 1 out of every 4 people gone. It's like the country is being hollowed out. Now, Cuba's own government claims far fewer left, officially about 14% of the population since 2020. Even if you took their numbers at face value, it'd still mean Cuba's had the world's second fastest population drop this decade, only behind Ukraine, a country at war. So if the official stats sound that bad, the real picture is probably worse. Most experts think so. According to the government, Cuba's population is expected to drop to around 9.7 million by 2026. But Juan Carlos Albizu Campos, a leading Cuban demographer, thinks the true number is closer to 8.25 million. That's an even bigger loss. Why is everyone leaving? Honestly, most are trying to escape an economy that's been falling apart just as fast. Since 2018, the economy shrank at least 15%, based on government data. Inflation exploded after the pandemic hit. Think about this. In 2019, $1 got you 20 Cuban pesos. By late 2025, it took 450 pesos to get just $1. That's 6 years straight of punishing inflation, eating away at savings and paychecks. Life on the island? Nearly impossible for most. Nearly 9 out of 10 Cubans now live in extreme poverty, according to the Cuban Observatory for Human Rights. 7 out of 10 say they have to skip a meal every day. Only 3% can actually find the medicine they need. About 12% of working-age people have no job, and 3 out of 4 Cubans either want to leave or know someone who does. Wages are a joke compared to the cost of living. The government's own data puts the average monthly salary at 6,500 pesos, just over $14 by street rates. Meanwhile, a 30-pack of eggs goes for 2,800 pesos, which is nearly half the typical monthly wage. Even basic foods like rice and beans cost about 3 whole days of work. And then there's fuel, or rather, the lack of it. Gas shortages are a constant headache. People line up for weeks to get their hands on just 40 liters, about 10.5 gallons, which sets them back around $46. That's more than some make in months. Roads that used to be crowded are empty now. Out in the countryside, folks have switched to using horses and carriages because there's simply no fuel. Even in big cities, public transportation's basically collapsed. The bottom line? Cuba is coming apart at the seams, and it's taking its people with it. Cuba's electricity crisis just keeps getting worse. Blackouts, sometimes citywide, sometimes countrywide, have turned into a regular part of life since 2020. In 2025 alone, there were at least 5 major nationwide blackouts. Summer makes it all the more brutal. When the temperature soars, most of the island loses power for at least 4 hours every day. People in smaller towns and rural areas outside the big cities have it even harder. They can go without electricity for up to 20 hours a day, leaving them with dead fridges, no AC, and not even a fan to keep cool. Cuba's power output has dropped about 25% compared to 2019, according to economist Ricardo Torres from American University. So the blackouts keep coming, and it's pretty clear why. Nearly all of Cuba's electricity comes from burning oil in old Soviet-era diesel generators, and those machines are just limping along. It doesn't help that Cuba's oil imports have shrunk too. Right now, 83% of Cuba's electricity comes from aging oil-burning generators, but Cuba imports 60% of its oil. For years, Venezuela was its lifeline, shipping over 100,000 barrels a day by 2021. By 2025, that had collapsed to just 16,000 barrels a day, as Venezuela's own crisis deepened. Then came January 2025. U.S. forces raided Venezuela and seized President Maduro. The Trump administration immediately threatened to cut off the remaining Venezuelan oil to Cuba. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, with Cuban family roots, signaled Cuba as the next target. Trump's message: Cuba is a failing nation right now. We want to help the people of Cuba. More blackouts and shortages are on the way. Rubio was even harsher. Cuba is a disaster. It's run by incompetent, senile men and, in some cases, not senile, but incompetent nonetheless. It has no economy. It's in total collapse. If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit. So now, with the U.S. government openly pressuring Cuba right after toppling Maduro next door, a lot of analysts think the communist regime, around for 67 years and counting, is closer to collapse than ever before. Some see this as the U.S. finally getting what it's wanted for decades. But let's be honest, people have been ringing that bell since the Soviet Union fell apart. In spite of everything, Cuba's Communist Party is still standing, still holding on. If you really want to make sense of how Cuba ended up in this tight spot, why it still has such a deadlock with the U.S. all these years after the Cold War, and why its communist leaders haven't been swept away by history, you have to rewind and look at how this all started. Right before the Cuban Revolution, the country was under the thumb of Fulgencio Batista. He was a classic dictator, hated by most Cubans, but a favorite in Washington because he did what the U.S. wanted, even when it hurt his own people. Batista started out as a colonel, served as president from 1940 to 1944, and then, seeing sure defeat in 1952, just took over by force. After that, he trashed the Constitution and got rid of basic freedoms. To stay in control, Batista cozied up to the U.S. government and the wealthy families who owned Cuba's biggest sugar plantations, which were the country's main economic engine. Then there was the mafia. American mobsters pretty much ran Havana's casinos and nightclubs thanks to Batista, who gave them special deals in exchange for steady bribes. Everybody on the island knew it. By the time Batista was done, foreigners owned about 70% of all of Cuba's farmland. They grabbed up the sugar plantations too, the country's biggest prize. One of the strangest scenes happened when an American phone company literally handed Batista a golden telephone during a public ceremony, just to thank him for jacking up phone rates sky high for ordinary Cubans. Batista didn't hide any of this. He made it clear. Pay him off, and he'd raise prices on his fellow Cubans for basic services, all to help out American companies. Not surprisingly, people hated him for it. As the country turned against him, Batista just doubled down. He ramped up censorship, set up his own secret police, and unleashed a wave of violence, mass arrests, torture, even public executions. Historians say up to 20,000 Cubans died under his rule, and many more ended up brutalized or locked away. Still, the U.S. government looked the other way. As long as their businesses made money, they didn't seem to care what was happening. People joked that the U.S. ambassador was really the second biggest boss in Cuba, pulling strings, sending weapons to Batista in exchange for more sweetheart deals. Batista and his friends in Washington crushed opposition so hard that more and more Cubans started listening to the revolutionaries, Castro, Che Guevara, and their guerrillas. On New Year's Day in 1959, Castro's rebels finally pushed Batista out. Batista ran off to the Dominican Republic, another dictatorship also propped up by the U.S., taking as much as $700 million in cash and art from the Cuban treasury. It was a massive blow to the country's new leaders. Castro, meanwhile, was wildly popular. Most Cubans loved him for ending Batista's dictatorship and also for his personal magnetism. The old elite, Batista's inner circle, started fleeing straight to South Florida almost overnight. At first, Castro said his revolution had nothing to do with communism. He tried to frame it as just restoring democracy. The U.S. wasn't buying it for a second. The Eisenhower administration started laying plans for what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion, training Cuban exiles to invade and take Castro down. Things escalated fast. When refineries in Cuba, still owned by Americans, refused to process Soviet oil, Castro seized them. The U.S. struck back by cutting off Cuban sugar imports. Castro hit back even harder, grabbing even more American-owned property in a classic tit-for-tat. Then, JFK took office in 1961. He inherited the Bay of Pigs plan and decided to go ahead with it. On the eve of the invasion, U.S. planes bombed Cuban airfields. Sensing which way things were going, Castro announced to the world that he was now a Marxist-Leninist. The next day, about 1,000 Cuban exiles stormed the beaches, without the promised U.S. air support. The invasion went sideways fast. Castro's forces captured or killed all of them, and paraded the survivors in a Havana sports stadium. Castro himself interrogated them on live TV. His popularity soared at home and across Latin America. He suddenly embodied the fight against American imperialism. After the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, everything changed. Castro pivoted right to the Soviet Union, locked in a one-party state, and declared Cuba a socialist country that wouldn't hold free elections. Cuba's revolution was homegrown, not imposed by Soviet tanks like in Eastern Europe. That origin gave the regime lasting legitimacy, especially after the U.S. tried to crush it to protect business interests. Tensions have remained frozen since 1961, when the U.S. broke ties and imposed a total trade embargo, allowing only food and medicine. Now 64 years old, it's the longest trade embargo in modern history and has devastated Cuba's economy. Since 1992, the UN General Assembly has voted annually to end it. Every year, the U.S. says no. In October 2025, 165 countries voted in favor. Only the U.S., Israel, Ukraine, Argentina, Hungary, Paraguay, and North Macedonia opposed. Cuban officials and the UN estimate the embargo has cost the economy between $130 and $148 billion over 6 decades. The goal was always to squeeze until the government cracked. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, the U.S. froze all of Cuba's assets held in America and banned nearly all financial dealings. Cut off from the U.S. and its global economy, Cuba needed a big new backer, and fast. For the next few decades, the Soviet Union filled that role, trading cheap oil for sugar and gaining a stronghold in the Western Hemisphere. Yes, Castro's regime was authoritarian, but it pulled off some big achievements too. Literacy shot up from 68% to 96% in just a few years. Healthcare? The state made it universal and free, turning Cuban doctors into a true export. Cuba sent medical teams abroad in exchange for fuel, food, and other resources. For a small island, that's a pretty creative way to get by. Still, not everyone was on board. Castro's government seized and nationalized tens of thousands of small businesses, wiped out private enterprise, and redistributed farmland. When dissent bubbled up, Fidel sometimes let those who wanted out leave, sort of as a pressure release valve. This tactic filtered out dissenters, leaving behind mostly loyal supporters. Right after the revolution, maybe 250,000 former business owners and landholders just picked up and left. Most headed across the Florida Straits to Miami. Then, between 1965 and 1973, the U.S. launched freedom flights, arranged by America, approved by Castro, flying another 300,000 Cubans to Miami, where they got a fast track to citizenship. This changed South Florida's makeup forever. These days, you can almost talk about two Cubas, the island and the Cuba that grew up in Florida. And the migration didn't stop. In 1980, after Cuba's economy took another hit, thousands rushed to the Peruvian embassy in Havana for asylum. Fidel responded by saying, "Anyone who wants out can go." Cuban Americans pulled together a makeshift fleet for the Mariel boat lift, ferrying people from Mariel Harbor to Miami in droves. Castro took this chance to empty his prisons and mental institutions, sending plenty of folks America wasn't exactly expecting, alongside those just desperate for a way out. In a matter of months, another 125,000 Cubans settled in Miami. Fast forward to now. Around 2 million people of Cuban descent live in the Miami metro area. That's about 1 out of every 3 Miamians, which makes Cubans the city's biggest ethnic group. Havana's metro population stands at roughly 2.15 million, so Miami's Cuban community is nearly as big and gaining fast. It might soon be the largest Cuban city anywhere. With recent waves of migrants since 2020, South Florida is now home to about a quarter of the number of Cubans still living on the island. Miami is known as the capital of Latin America. About 70% of folks there speak Spanish at home, and it's the only major U.S. city where Latinos are the majority. Miami also boasts the largest GDP of any mainly Spanish-speaking city worldwide, more than double that of Cuba itself. And since 2020, another label's stuck: Wall Street South. More than $1 trillion has shifted to Miami from New York, thanks to lower taxes and a business-friendly attitude, with over 50 big investment firms choosing to relocate their headquarters there. Miami's roots run deep as a haven for Cuban exiles. The city became what Cuba couldn't: the beacon of capitalism in the Western Hemisphere. Families fled for generations, swapping the strict communist system for Miami's open embrace. It's kind of like how West Germany stood apart from East Germany, or South Korea from North Korea. Miami embodied the free market alternative just off Cuba's shore. When the Soviet Union collapsed in '91, Cuba lost its main supporter and spiraled into what they called the Special Period. That decade was brutal. Imports and exports pretty much evaporated, falling by more than 80%, and the economy shrank about a third by '93. People thought communism would finally collapse. Then, in '94, with riots across Havana, Fidel told Cubans who wanted to leave that they were free to go. Suddenly, about 35,000 took off on whatever would float: ramshackle rafts, old boats, anything that might carry them to Miami. That mass exodus shifted U.S. policy. Clinton's administration introduced the wet feet, dry feet rule. Cuban refugees caught at sea went back, but if they made it to U.S. soil, they could stay and even seek citizenship. Tension between Miami and Havana kept rising. In 1996, Brothers to the Rescue, a group of Cuban American exiles, flew over Cuba and dropped leaflets against Castro. The Cuban Air Force shot down 2 of their planes, killing 4 people. Then, in 1997, anti-communist militants bombed hotels in Havana, killing an Italian tourist and injuring 11 others. Luis Posada Carriles, a Cuban-American exile and ex-CIA officer, organized the attacks. He'd already been linked to a deadly airline bombing back in '76. Carriles snuck into the U.S. under a fake passport and got political asylum. Cuba demanded that America extradite him, but it never happened, and relations got even more strained. A year later, 5 Cuban intelligence officers, the Cuban Five, were arrested in Miami for spying. Cuba admitted they were agents, but claimed they only monitored exile groups, not U.S. government secrets. Most of the five served more than 15 years. Only a prisoner swap in Obama's era freed them. Then came Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez came to power and began shipping cheap oil to Cuba in exchange for doctors and security personnel. At its peak, 2008 to 2015, Venezuela sent about 100,000 barrels a day, over half of Cuba's needs. With 30,000 Cuban doctors in Venezuela, Cuba could even resell excess oil to China, pocketing cash despite U.S. sanctions. For decades, U.S.-Cuba relations remained frozen. Then, in December 2014, Obama and Raúl Castro shocked the world by reopening diplomatic ties. Obama's bet: engagement would soften the regime. Embassies reopened after 54 years. Cuba was removed from the terrorism list. Travel rules relaxed, and U.S. airlines and cruise ships moved in. Tourism boomed, Airbnb took off, and Cuba's economy grew over 4% in 2015. Obama visited Havana, the first U.S. president in 88 years. That window slammed shut under Trump. To win over conservative Cuban Americans in Florida, still bitter over lost property and ideological rivalry, he promised to reverse Obama's policies. In 2016, 54% of Florida's Cuban Americans voted Trump, compared to 41% for Clinton. Trump carried Florida by just 112,000 votes out of 9 million. If Cuban Americans had voted like other Latinos, Clinton would have won Florida and the presidency. Their support handed Trump the election. Trump reversed Obama's Cuba policy, tightened travel, capped remittances, and choked cash flow. After 2017's Havana syndrome, the U.S. slashed embassy staff, stopped visas, and cut travel. By 2019, hotels, flights, and Western Union were shut down. Sanctions hit Venezuelan oil. Trump relisted Cuba as a terror sponsor, cutting off international banking. On top of the 60-year embargo, the pandemic then gutted tourism and remittances, from $3.7 billion in 2019 to just over $1 billion in 2021. Internally, the economy was failing. Food production collapsed, no fertilizer, no incentive. Meanwhile, the military's Geisa controls 40% of the economy and holds $18 billion in assets. Officially, the U.S. is blamed, but Geisa hoards cash while shortages bite. In the lead-up to 2023, Cuba's major industries just unraveled. Sugar production crashed by 68%, fishing by 53%, farming by 52%, and manufacturing dropped by 41%. And tourism was already in freefall, largely because Geisa kept pouring cash into the wrong places. So, this is the foundation of Cuba's current meltdown. With hardly any foreign cash coming in, basic services caved. Biden promised to undo Trump's maximum pressure campaign and dial things back to the Obama days. But once in office, nothing. He left almost all of Trump's policies in place, nervous about angering the politically powerful, hardline Cuban American community in Florida ahead of 2024. He eventually ended the travel and remittance caps, but kept Cuba stuck on the terrorism list, locking them out of the global financial system. Then, finally, just days before leaving on January 14, 2025, Biden took Cuba off the list. It was a gesture, but one with zero time to matter. Trump moved right back into the White House, and on day one, put Cuba right back on the list. With pretty much everything still locked up by sanctions, COVID gutting tourism, and Venezuela's oil lifeline drying up, down to 32,000 barrels a day in 2024, only 16,000 by 2025, Cubans faced fuel shortages, more blackouts, and misery. In the summer of 2021, frustration boiled over. People hit the streets in massive anti-government protests, and authorities cracked down hard. Hundreds were arrested, and at least 710 people got charged with harsh crimes like sedition, the kind of thing that sends you to prison for decades. Out of all this chaos came an exodus unlike anything Cuba had seen since the 1980s. When Nicaragua made it easier for Cubans to travel there in 2020, hundreds of thousands bought tickets and made their way north to the U.S. border. During Biden's years, at least 850,000 Cubans entered the U.S. Now with Trump back and Marco Rubio, the ultimate hawk, as Secretary of State, the administration has a Cuban exile at the center of U.S. policy. Rubio's been laser-focused on bringing down Cuba's Communist Party his whole career, and now he's in the driver's seat. His plan? Shut off what remains of Venezuela's oil shipments and force the Cuban government into an even deeper crisis. The hope is that no one, Mexico, Russia, whoever, steps in to bail Cuba out this time. Whether all this finally breaks the communist regime is still a huge question. There's a real risk of a Haiti-style collapse. Chaos, desperation, a failed state just 90 miles from Florida. At the same time, Cuba's Communist Party has held on to power for almost 70 years, outlasting the Castro's retirement and deaths. Power is now in the hands of Miguel Diaz-Canel, the first leader outside the Castro family since the 1950s. But Raúl Castro, at 94, still pulls strings behind the scenes, at least for now. Once he's gone, there's every chance the old order falls apart. Whether Cuba's brand of communism can survive without a Castro is anybody's guess. The Trump administration is unlikely to invade Cuba like it did Venezuela. Too risky. A Haiti-style collapse could trigger a migrant crisis that spills into U.S. politics. Instead, expect the old playbook. Keep the embargo, cut off oil, and wait for the Communist Party to cave. The hope? Cuba relaxes controls, opens to private business, returns seized property, and releases political prisoners. In exchange, the U.S. eases sanctions. Cuba's regime is in deep trouble, but don't count it out yet. Like North Korea in the 90s, it could survive despite famine, isolation, and collapse predictions. If this helped you understand Cuba's crisis, like the video, subscribe to infographics, and share it with someone who needs it. Understanding the big forces shaping our world, even when they're messy and heartbreaking, is the first step toward actually doing something about them. Cuba's story shows us how history, ideology, and geopolitics can create problems that drag on. And honestly, the only thing we can be sure of is uncertainty. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next video.